The Zimbabwean government says it has outsmarted some individuals and entities that were behind the sharp rise in foreign exchange rates. This has seen the US dollar falling against the local unit. President Mnangagwa said this while addressing Zanu-PF supporters of North America Division in New York over the weekend. President Mnangagwa expressed satisfaction with how government dealt with what he calls cash barons who were responsible for the sharp increase of the exchange rate. Referring to the newly introduced mono currency as initially stable, the president told his party supporters that the government became smarter than people who were trying to push the exchange rate to unbearable limits. Meanwhile, the sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe keep on ravaging the country. There's high inflation and shortages of basic supplies such as fuel, power and water. Inflation is currently at a 10-year high, shrinking salaries and pensions, while the price of bread has increased fivefold since April. About 5 million Zimbabweans are currently in need of food aid, according to the United Nations. A group of 16 African countries has called on the US and EU to immediately lift sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe. Tanzanian President John Magufuli, who is also the chairman of SADC, says the policy was hurting the region. The sanctions were imposed in 2002 when the late Robert Mugabe was president. And President Mnangagwa blames them for crippling development in the country, and he says removing them would attract Western investors to Zimbabwe after close to 2 decades of economic isolation. To tell us more about the current state of the economy in Zimbabwe under sanctions, we're joined by Rutendo Benson Matinyarare. Thank you very much for coming, Rutendo.
Good afternoon, Colin, and thank you very much. And good day to the viewers.
From your eyewitness perspective, how would you describe the current Zimbabwean economy still under the sanctions?
The Zimbabwean economy currently resembles a war zone. It is a country that has been under attack and under the barrage of what I call economic weapons. And those economic weapons have caused what we would expect to happen in a country that is at war. There's destruction of infrastructure, destruction of institutions, destruction of people's lives, and the death and displacement of people that have become refugees that come here into South Africa.
In simpler terms, is this what we can call self-inflicted practices of trying to subdue the people when they try to speak out against the dire economic circumstances?
I wouldn't say that. What it is that the reality is a country like the United States of America, which is an economic superpower and a military superpower, imposed a national emergency on Zimbabwe. That national emergency then came with weapons that were put on the country in the terms of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act that are weapons of economics. But what we always say to people is that the sanctions that are placed by the United States and their European partners don't always come with just economic weapons, but economic sabotage and even what we call black ops operations that are taking place in the country, like the sabotage of the currency, the shortages that we see, and many other activities that are now causing political unrest and people to go onto the streets. These are the kind of activities that happen in times of war that are happening in Zimbabwe at the moment. So it's not an excuse, and it is not a way to keep people quiet, to shut people up from the issues that they've got in the country.
Why is the economy dysfunctional even when it can have local economic activity that can keep bread on the table, so that when you go to the shops you can find oil, eggs and bread and so forth? Why are the goods that are manufactured locally not being able to feed the whole nation, irrespective of the sanctions?
I think it's important for us to ask the same question. Why is it that during the Second World War, countries like England, France, and the European nations couldn't produce bread and make functional economies? When a country is under war, when a country is under whatever form of sanction or prohibition, it is unable to function naturally. And this is the problem that we're seeing in Zimbabwe.
But what about local productivity? Well, what I'm asking in essence is that there are farms in Zimbabwe and they continue to farm, and there's agro-processing. So for foodstuffs to be transported to the food market, why isn't it as clear as daylight that that is so simplistic, but then it's becoming so deadlocked that one doesn't understand from an outside-inside perspective as to why are the people hungry?
The very first thing that these sanctions did is they attacked the economic engine of Zimbabwe. And that meant agriculture, that meant the production of seeds, and particularly fertilizers. So right now, if you wanted fertilizers in Zimbabwe, you've got to import those fertilizers. The companies that give us the inputs for those fertilizers are American companies, Rockefeller-owned companies that are not giving those inputs because of sanctions. And then we've got the issue of seeds that I raised the other time when we were talking about the issue of Mugabe's legacy, is that the seeds are being created and bred as hybrids by the very same European and Western companies that are also making them expensive and sometimes not even giving us those seeds. All these factors affect the ability to produce food. And so when people cannot produce food, and then they don't have a currency because of an additional element of the sanctions that causes balance of payment issues and the inability of the country to trade, then you have a problem of producing food, you have a problem producing anything. In the factories, they cannot currently retool, they cannot buy new machines, because a lot of the machines that are required in these industries come from the very same Western countries that have got sanctions on Zimbabwe. And even if you wanted to import those very same machines from, say, China, a lot of the IP in the Chinese companies is also coming from Western companies.
Let's talk about when the economy was not working after 2002. The tenure of the late Robert Mugabe had the Look to the East policy. How has that impacted on the economy, and why has it failed to turn around?
We live in a global world, and this global world is one that is dominated by the Americans. Payment systems are 70% in American currency or US dollars. A lot of the 25% of the world's global business is done in America. So anybody that wants to do business in America has to cooperate with America. They need to have bilateral agreements and relationships with America. These bilateral relationships are the ones that America uses to enforce its sanctions, or what I call the executive order sanctions, and to ensure that other countries across the world implement those sanctions or they suffer secondary sanctions. So for instance, Chinese companies and Chinese banks wanting to transact with Zimbabwe, small little economy, will be penalized for transacting with Zimbabwe if they then want to go and transact with the Americans. So the executive order sanctions actually say that if a country or company assists the government of Zimbabwe, software, finance, logistics, machinery, equipment and trade, that company can also face sanctions because the Americans are trying to make their sanctions effective.
Okay, Rutendo, there is so much to talk about regarding the sanctions in Zimbabwe. Surely this is not the last time we talk about this. We need to go deeper and address other external factors. But for now, thank you very much for making time to speak to us.
Thank you.